welcome back for those of you who were here last night, and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. For those of you who weren't here, come alone, but I'm not alone. My wife and one-year-old are back in Texas, and I have a little one on the way due in April. And if you want to know what my wife is like, opposites attract, so everything I'm not, she is. I talk in front of people, and I'm an introvert. She doesn't like to talk in front of people, and she's an extrovert. She's spunky and fun. I'm rather dull and boring. She likes to go out and do things. I like to sit at home and read a book. So if that's any help, that's what she's like. And taking care of our little boy. He's quite active and I think has my wife's personality. Apparently I just was a calm child and didn't do much as a kid. And he's a lot of fun. In case you weren't with us last night, I want to review the approach we're taking to these scientific issues we're going to discuss this morning and this afternoon. We talked about the relevance of this issue to every believer. Really, when we're talking about creation evolution, we're not just talking about an isolated, scientific, nerdy question that a few people should care about. This is an issue that strikes at the text of Scripture. It strikes at the nature of God. It strikes at the gospel itself. So it's an issue that's relevant to every believer. And it's an issue that's relevant to every unbeliever, because Romans 1 says everyone knows God exists. They can see it from nature. They can see His existence from nature, His attributes from nature. And so when believers take a different view than what Genesis teaches, they change that testimony of nature. They change what Scripture says about God. And they're giving the unbeliever an excuse to reject God. The unbeliever knows God exists, and the unbeliever tries to suppress that truth. And one of the ways the unbeliever does it is by evolution and science, saying science proves evolution. However, our goal this weekend is not to sort of put evolution and creation side by side and keep a score sheet. We'll do a little bit of that, because we want to understand what the science says. But really, evolution is removed from the discussion before we even get to the science. Why? Because if evolution is true, just do a little thought experiment. If what Darwin said is true, everything's the product of time and chance, I'm the product of time and chance, so are you, my brain is, your brain is, the words I'm speaking, the thoughts you're thinking, the words you're hearing, that's just random chemical reactions. There's no way to know that anything we're doing has any meaning. We don't even know we're having a conversation. We can't, if evolution is true. So this is philosophically, logically incoherent, and it defeats itself. However, people will live with logical inconsistencies and still raise scientific issues. So that's what we want to discuss. We covered the claim that design is an illusion last night, going through an analogy with design in the cell. In case you missed it, that talk is essentially a book chapter in the book Creation Basics and Beyond. I'll talk about that at the end of this talk. Some of what I cover is in book chapters in that book as well. So this morning we want to deal with this claim that there are multiple independent lines of evidence for evolution. And this kind of goes hand in hand with what we talked about last night. In one breath, the evolutionists will say, yes, life looks designed. They'll acknowledge that if they're honest. Yes, it looks like it's designed, but that's an illusion because evolution explains it. And we look at all the clues that are around us in nature, and we see a pretty compelling case. That's what they say. And we want to dissect that. And we mentioned last night the bottom line for any of these discussions is that good science is always in agreement with Scripture. Another way of saying it is there's two ways to harmonize the Bible and science. You interpret the Bible correctly, interpret science correctly. They will agree. You can also harmonize the Bible and science if you mess up the interpretation of Scripture and you mess up the interpretation of science. You can get that to agree too. So just because there's agreement doesn't mean we've got the right answer. So what I want to show you then is the ways the evolutionists misinterpret the evidence. Now, there's something to keep in mind. We could spend a whole day, a whole week on the evidence for evolution and try to refute it. And you could spend a year with your unbelieving friends, and they might still raise this issue. So here's some survey by the Pew Research Forum from 2009, the views in the public and among scientists on evolution. So they were asked to yay or nay whether or not humans were the product of strictly naturalistic evolution. And among the general public, only about a third accept that. And the stats for many years have been around half of folks still accept some form of creation. Of course, this really irritates all the scientists because so many years of trying to indoctrinate people with evolution, they're still not buying it. However, the number I want to draw your attention to this morning is this right here. Nearly 9 in 10 scientists hold evolution. And this is, I think the folks they surveyed were just members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This isn't a survey of the Skeptic Society, let's say. This is just scientists who have this professional membership. And if you change the survey to include a statement, let's say, God guided evolution, that number goes up to about 97%. So only 3% of scientists would deny evolution. And so if you're talking to an unbeliever, they'll say, you know, everything you say sounds great. It makes a lot of sense. But why are there so many smart people out there who don't agree with you? It really bothers the unbelieving mind. For someone who really wants to understand the issue, that number is a hard fact to get around. It's a tough pill to swallow. So as we're talking about the evidence, just keep that in mind, and we'll try to return to that figure at the end. Now, someone might say, well, those are probably unbelievers. And a significant chunk of that 87% are folks who'd be explicitly atheistic. There's a big chunk of scientists who are. But if I did the math correctly, about 46% of those folks would hold to some theistic religious view. Not necessarily a Christian view, but they'd say higher power. They're not explicitly atheistic. You've got people like Francis Collins, we mentioned him last night. How do you explain, here's a smart guy who's been heavily involved in deciphering the human DNA sequence. He's made some important medical discoveries, claims to be born again, but he holds to evolution. And he thinks the church should, and he's fairly aggressive, at least his colleagues are now, in trying to persuade the church of the fact of evolution. So what do you do with those folks? Why are there so many non-atheists who hold evolution? We'll return to that at the end. What I want to do now is walk through 4 of the main arguments for evolution and show you how the evolutionists interpret the evidence and where they go wrong. So maybe the leading textbook argument for evolution is the claim that we see it happening right now. We see evolution all around us, they might say. And perhaps the leading textbook example comes from what we call Darwin's finches. So when Darwin took his voyage around the globe on the Beagle, one of the stops he made was in the Galapagos. That's that little white dot there off the coast of South America. It's actually a group of islands. And when Darwin visited the Galapagos, he didn't make the textbook observations that you see today. It took about 100 years for 2 scientists to go back, Peter and Rosemary Grant. They're a couple at Princeton. And they've been studying the finches on these islands in great detail for several decades. Now, there's about 12 to 14 species of finches that are native to these islands. About 12 are shown here. The screen's a little dark, but hopefully what you can see is that there's significant differences in the size and shape of these guys' beak. Some have big, thick bills, some longer, skinnier ones. And what Darwin proposed with his Origin of Species was something radical for the day. Perhaps these finches were not created in place on the Galapagos Islands. Perhaps they evolved from a common ancestor. So the wrong view of creation back in the 1800s was that God created every species in its present location. Of course, that excludes any idea of the flood, so therefore it's erroneous. But that's what he was reacting to. And so to propose that these guys had a common ancestor was something pretty radical. Well, Peter and Rosemary Grant have been focusing their attention on one of these species, this medium ground finch right here. You can see it's got a fairly thick bill. And they've been studying them ever since the late 70s. It's really tedious work. You go there for a summer or so, several months, you just measure the beak size over and over again. That's what scientists do, and apparently have fun doing it. So if you do those measurements, I've electronically tried to illustrate that in this one species, there is variation in the size and shape of the beak. There's an average size, but there's variety even among the individuals. And that small change, there's only about a 0.5 millimeter difference on average that changes. But that has an effect on their diet. So those guys with the big thick bill can crack the seeds on the island that are rather intimidating looking like these. That beak is rather useful to crack these open. These guys that have longer, thinner ones can't do it so well. So they consume the smaller seeds. Okay, well, evolution is supposed to happen by natural selection, survival of the fittest. So what did Peter and Rosemary Grant observe? There was a drought one of the years, several of the years, but during one of the years in which there was a drought, these plants were selectively eliminated, and so guess what happens to those finches with the smaller beaks? They get eliminated as well. Survival of the fittest, those guys that can eat survive to reproduce. Well, the opposite happened, El Nino, so that's heavy rains, which had the reverse effect. These seeds get wiped out, or at least these guys selectively die off, these guys survive to reproduce. Okay, what's the excitement? Well, remember there's about 12 to 14 species. They differ in the size and shape of their beaks, so maybe if this process repeats itself long enough, we'll see the formation of a new species, maybe some guy that has a little bit longer beak. And here's a summary of their results. So this is 1977, goes up to about 1984, 1985. Here's what they've measured is from here to here. How tall is that beak? So on average, it's about 9.5 millimeters. And during a dry year, that average went up a little bit, about half a millimeter, up again during dry year, up again, down during a wet year. And so they've seen this change in the species in response to the environment. So they'd say, look, survival of the fittest, this is what we expect to see if evolution's true. So the key question now is, what does Scripture say? Is there another explanation for these things? Now, Scripture doesn't use the term species in Hebrew. English Bibles may use that term during translation. The key term in Scripture is what the English Bibles translate kind. The Hebrew word is min, M-I-N. And I've got a book chapter on kinds and on species, so I'm just going to summarize this really quickly. That word kind is used about 31 times in Scripture, most of the time in Genesis 1, Genesis 6, a few times in the Levitical laws, talking about what's clean and unclean, and then one use, I think, in Ezekiel. So when God created everything in 6 days, He created creatures according to their kind. So in Genesis 1, it seems to refer to some sort of created category or group according to their grouping, their kind. The flood account suggests that reproductive compatibility defines or helps us understand where that boundary is. And to summarize a lot of work over the years, it looks like kind is best approximated by the classification category of family. That's a couple levels up from species. So kind is not the same thing as species. That's the first key point. And what kind is probably better approximated by is this classification category family. So maybe you learn in high school, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then there's 2 more levels before you get to species. Okay, so it's approximately the level of family. Big deal. What does it have to do with Darwin's finches? Well, if you look at those 31 uses of the term, you never find a verse that says change within a kind is forbidden or can't happen. And when you look at what has happened in nature, you reach a really striking conclusion. So here are 3 species that are all part of the same family. Horse, donkey, zebra, they all belong to the family Equidae. They're all equids. Well, God told Noah not to take 2 of every species on board the ark, but 2 of every kind. So he probably didn't take a zebra, a horse, a donkey. He took 2 members of this family, and from those 2 have descended all the species we see today, including all the breeds of horses. That, by the way, is a Z-donk, a cross between a zebra and a donkey. So these guys can still breed. Their offspring are, by and large, sterile, but they're 4,000 years since the flood, there's still this ability to reproduce. Now, does the fact that they can't breed today mean they're probably not part of the same kind? No. What if, in the human realm, brother and sister marry? Well, many years now since creation, mutations have accumulated in our DNA, so the chance of brother-sister marrying and not being able to reproduce is pretty high. So if brother-sister marry, they can't have kids, does that mean they're separate species? They're separate, not part of the human family? Or then, no, it just means there's enough DNA genetic meltdown that when you're that close, you just can't reproduce. So DNA changes in the 4,000 years since the flood probably explain why they can't reproduce today, but immediately following the flood, they probably could. Well, how in the world do you produce this much change? Well, look at how much change we've been able to produce in horses. You've got a Clydesdale, you've got a pony, all from a common ancestor. And these breeds were not produced by crazy scientists going in and changing the DNA letter by letter. Someone said, well, this horse has the coat color I want, this horse has the size I want, let's breed them. And with the variety that's present in both, you can produce an enormous spectrum of change. So it's not that hard to produce 3 wild species from 2 individuals on board the ark. Here's another example, the cats. So all cat species belong to the same family, Felidae. Big cats, small cats. By the way, lion and tiger can breed on occasion in captivity. Cougar can breed with the big cats. Cougar can also breed with an ocelot. And so you can connect all of these cats, large and small, in a reproductive continuum. And once again, Noah took kinds on board the ark, not species. So he probably took 2 felids on board the ark. And from those felids, we see, and all the species have descended in form that we see today. Okay, so change within a kind is permissible. Change between kinds, so changing a cat into a horse, Scripture seems to imply that can't happen. Why? Well, God told Noah to bring 2 of every land, air-breathing kind on board the ark to keep them alive, to keep their lineage going, essentially is what the Scripture says. Well, if you could change one kind into another, why would you bring 2 of every kind? You'll just bring 2 worms, and then once the flood's done, you change the worm, and you'll produce horses, donkeys, zebras, elephants, you name it. The fact that you need 2 of every kind implies that there's a limit to change. So I think it's safe to assume you can't change a hippo into a tiger. That may seem obvious, but evolution says that's possible, given enough time. There's no direction, no purpose to evolution, so given enough time, that guy might become a tiger. From a scriptural perspective, it seems plausible that dogs cannot be changed to cats. You can get lots of variety within the cat kind. You can get variety within the dog kind. We have enormous variety in dog breeds. And within the dog family, Canidae, you've got wolves, you've got foxes, you've got coyotes. So a similar story as with the cats. Lots of variety within the kind, but you can't interconvert them. Okay, but what about Darwin's finches? They belong to a family that has about 1,000 species. And here's a few representatives. Look at the enormous variety in beak length, beak shape, beak size. Look at the differences in plumage. And all this from 2 or 7, I don't remember if these are clean or unclean, individuals on board the ark. That's an enormous variety, enormous amount of change in just 4,000 years since the flood. So when we look at this sort of change, big deal. That's nothing compared to what has already happened since Noah's flood ended. So when we talk about observable evolution, and that was just one example, and all the examples the evolutionists cite boil down to this. Every example they cite is change within a kind, and that's perfectly biblically permissible. So when the textbooks talk about we can see evolution happening, all they're really showing us is what the Bible says would happen and is permitted, change within kinds. Okay, what other arguments do the evolutionists use? Transitional forms has been one of the main arguments for many, many years. And so here are a few common examples. Where did birds come from? The evolutionists say from dinosaurs, from reptiles. Dinosaurs eventually evolved some feather-like feature, moved into the trees, and evolved the ability to fly. And they say, the evidence of this, you can see creatures like Archaeopteryx. It's got feathers like a bird, but claws and perhaps scales on its leg that look very reptilian. So this seems like the perfect evidence. It blends the features of birds and reptiles in one. And what other idea predicts the existence of this type of creature? What about mammals? What about reptiles? Where do they come from in the first place? Well, from the sea. Evolutionists say life started in the sea. Eventually you have to evolve creatures on the land. And so here we have Tiktaalik, published, I think, in 2004, called the fishapod. Scales like a fish, fins like a fish, a head that looks very, amphibian-like, reptile-like. Again, it seems to blend the features of fish and land creatures in one. They'd say this is exactly what you'd expect were evolution true. What about whales? The evolutionists don't say that whales evolved from fish, they say they evolved from mammals. So once that tiktaalik evolves on land, and then you see the formation of reptiles, amphibians, mammals, well, eventually those mammals go back into the ocean. You start with some four-legged, tailed creature up here. Over time, that creature loses its upright posture, it becomes more squatty, tail becomes, hind limbs are lost, now you're in the ocean, there's modern whales. So this series of intermediates that blends the features of land mammals and sea mammals is exactly what you'd expect in light of evolution. That's what they say. Now what's the response to this? What's the scientific problem with this? Of course, for many years, evolution has been criticized because even in this diagram, there's still big gaps between these creatures. Where's the smooth series of intermediates? Archaeopteryx, where's the half-scale, half-feather intermediate form? There's a second problem, though, that I think is perhaps even more difficult to address. Here we have the platypus. Is this a transitional form? We can use the same type of language. It blends the features of mammals, reptiles, birds. It's got a duck bill. It suckles its young. It's got a venom gland like reptiles do. So what is it? It blends the features of all these different types of creatures. Well, really, it's a mosaic. So maybe you're familiar with that art form. It's got all these little pieces, and if you arrange those pieces in just the right way, you can produce all sorts of different pictures. So we've got a piece from a bird, we've got pieces from reptiles, so to speak. Okay, well, big deal. We're just arguing over terms, right? No. Go to the human realm. What do humans build? Well, here's a tank designed to pack a big punch, a lot of firepower, and deliver it on all sorts of terrain on the land. Those tank treads are very well designed for movement on the land on all sorts of terrain. Now, if you drop that tank in the water, it's going to sink like a rock. And so human engineers build other structures, other vehicles for moving through the water, like this boat, this gunboat, designed for moving very quickly on the land. And you can see in the background there, aircraft carrier, a floating airport basically. So we've designed vehicles for conquering the aquatic environment. Of course, you put these boats on the land, they do nothing, they're useless. What's this? A transitional form. Not that this vehicle is on its way to becoming a tank, but it blends the features of boats and with tanks. It's got tank treads, yet it can float. It's designed to conquer the transitional environment. It's not a perfect boat, it's not a perfect tank, but it's the perfect vehicle for the environment between the sea and the land. It's a mosaic. That's the point. So the platypus is a mosaic. Those transitional forms I showed you are at best mosaics. The way I defined it was it blends the features of two fully formed creatures. And when we just look around us, mosaics are the product of intelligent design. So the evolutionist says, what else predicts the existence of Archaeopteryx, the existence of Tiktaalik? Well, if we just looked around us, we'd see mosaics are the product of intelligent design. So the fact that we don't see these millions of intermediate forms, and the fact that we see that intelligent engineers build vehicles that blend the features of two fully functional vehicles, should cause us to rethink these supposed intermediates. This seems well designed to perhaps move between land and air. This guy seems well designed for inhabiting perhaps a shallow aquatic environment. These, well, this is just really poor. I mean, there's still big gaps. This doesn't even look like a whale. So this guy's obviously a mostly land, perhaps somewhat shallow marine creature, and this is obviously an aquatic creature. The point is these transitional forms, the best examples the evolutionists can give us, look like they're the product of intelligent design, not the product of evolution. So that argument fails as well. There's an equally valid, if not better, alternative explanation for the existence of transitional forms. Third argument. So this gets a little bit more sticky. I'm calling it homology. That's the evolutionary term. Homo means the same. Homosexual, same sex. This is the study of biological similarity, sameness. And the classic example, of course, is the structure of the forelimb. So if you were to peel back the skin, the muscles on your arm, and down to the bone, you'd see something that looks like this. and it's been color-coded to highlight the order of the bones from top to bottom. So you have one bone up here, two bones here, a little clump of bones in yellow here, and then the digits. It's kind of sing-song. One bone, two bones, little Bob's digits. So what's the point? You see that same structure, that same order in a variety of other species. So the dog, forelimb, from top to bottom, one bone, two bones, little Bob's digits. The bird, one bone, two bones, little Bob's digits. One bone, two bones, and the whale, two little Bob's digits. You go to the BioLogos website, they'll say, how do you explain this? From a design perspective, there's 1,000 different ways to do this. Why is it that the one pattern we see is shared across all these very different creatures? Now, the specific outworking of the pattern is obviously different. These digits here are obviously very different from the human. But the underlying pattern's the same. That's the point the evolutionists make, and they say there is design doesn't satisfy as an explanation. So what's the answer to this? Well, if you look in the parking lot after we're done, or here's just a picture for illustration purposes, we see all sorts of sedans, all sorts of vehicles that share a lot of features. Headlights in the front, trunk in the back, one steering wheel, and an America on a particular side of the car. Seats facing forward, roof on top, chassis on the bottom. Why? Is it because these cars evolved from a common ancestor? You've got the same pattern in Asian automaking factories, and US ones, and European ones. Why is that? Is it because they evolved from the Arctic or something? No, it's because the pattern works. It fits a functional purpose. You could take that evolutionary logic and apply it equally well here. There's 1,000 different ways to design a car. Yet what we see out there and on the screen is a very similar pattern among them all. Why? Because it works. And from an engineering perspective, if you have a similar purpose, you're going to use a similar design. And you don't need a PhD to understand that. This is not some obscure concept. This is just, look what human engineers do. Humans are made in the image of God. So would it be any surprise that God would reuse similar patterns when they work? Now, the evolutionists take that argument and apply it not just in anatomy, they apply it to the developmental process, they apply it to DNA. But you could again use that same principle for all of them. If you were to go to the Mercedes factory, the Ford factory, go to the Hyundai factory, you'd probably find a similar developmental process. Similar principles applied in building each of these vehicles. Why? Because the physics are the same. You look at the blueprints, those are going to be shared as well for those vehicles that are similar in the final product stage. So this would be analogous then to DNA. We'd expect to find DNA similarities as well, because DNA ultimately encodes the final anatomical product. So when we're looking at this underlying similar pattern among very different creatures, we should think, again, design. Not because we need a lot of design training, but look outside. That's what human engineers do. They reuse these patterns. So homology, upon close inspection, is good evidence for design. Now, the last example I want to walk us through is maybe one of the stickiest. I taught a class on origins when I first started at ICR. We had a Master's of Science Ed program, and I gave this example to my students as an exercise. And one of them came back to me and said, "This is really shaking me. I don't know what the answer is. This is a real bothersome problem." And so we walked through it. But this is the way the evolutionists argue it. You can find it in some of their websites. The analogy works like this. Let's say you're a teacher, and some of you are, and some of you homeschool moms would teach your kids. Let's say you have two students who have been asked to write a short answer or an essay question for a test. And they give you an answer, each of them, that looks kind of like this. First student says, "The political rise and presidency of Abraham Lincoln bear striking resemblance to the current president's history and policy, both beginning as legislators from Illinois. Obama and Lincoln in the office treated the law," and on the answer goes. And student number 2 submits an identical answer, same word, same sentence structure. It's 100% the same. Now, you might begin to suspect, as a sharp teacher, that perhaps they copied from one another. Now, if you were to confront them, they might vigorously deny it and say, no, 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 we just studied the same material. We just happened to memorize the same answer. Well, excuse me, my phone keeps making noise, so we'll put it down there. If you were looking through their answers and you found not only identical words that are spelled the same, but words that were spelled wrongly, and both of them misspelled them, now your case for plagiarism gets a little stronger. Your case for cheating. What's the chance that both students are going to misspell a basic word the same way, the same spot, just by chance at the same time? And if you found not one but several grammatical and spelling errors, and they all show up in the same spot, same paragraph, same point in the sentence, the chance of all that occurring just naturally is pretty low. Another way of saying it is there's a really high probability that one of these students copied from the other. The more shared mistakes you find, the stronger your case for plagiarism. And so the evolutionists apply this logic then to the genetic realm. We have a DNA sequence, about 3 billion letters, that specifies our anatomy and physiology. Chimpanzees have a very long DNA sequence as well. The evolutionists will say we can find similarities, but beyond similarities in DNA sequences, we can find shared mistakes. You can find, let's say at position 100,295,342, a letter that's been changed, and we can see that this is a mistake. Well, you can find that very same change in the chimpanzee sequence, and not just one change in those 3 billion letters, but multiple. This is just a sequence for illustrative purposes. So therefore, the evolutionist says, both of these sequences must have been plagiarized, inherited, from a common ancestor who also had these mistakes. One of their strongest arguments for common ancestry. So what's the problem with this? Any guesses? Anyone want to take a crack at it? Well, let's do a little exercise. Here are two sentences, one on the left, one on the right. And I want you to look at the sentence on the left and find the mistake, not just any mistake, but the mistake that's shared with the sentence on the right. Any volunteers? No Russian speakers. Okay, not fair. Let's make it easier. That was Cyrillic alphabet. Let's use an alphabet we're more familiar with. Same thing, sentence on the left compared to the sentence on the right. Find not the shared word, the shared mistake. No German speakers. Well, here's the English sentence. It's, of course, a trick question. I just plugged this into Google Translate. A Russian speaker said there actually is an inaccuracy in that first sentence. But the point is this: if you don't speak the language, you can't identify mistakes. So the question is, do we speak the language of DNA well enough, or do the evolutionists speak the language of DNA well enough to identify shared mistakes between humans and chimpanzees? Well, when the human DNA sequence was first published in 2001 by Francis Collins and his group, the view among scientists was that 95% of those 3 billion letters were useless. They were just leftovers from the long 6 million year history of evolution for humans, and that they did nothing. Well, another group of secular scientists published a paper in 2012, where they systematically went through all 3 billion letters. This was an enormously time-intensive, labor-intensive experiment. A whole bunch of different biochemical assays. And they found preliminary evidence for function for 80% of those 3 billion letters. So 2001, 95% do nothing. 2012, 80% do something, and that number is probably going to go up. That's a complete about-face. So if you went to Russia and said, yeah, I speak 5% of the language, how many of you would volunteer as a proofreader? It'd be silly. So the problem with this argument that there are shared mistakes between humans and chimpanzees is that we're really bad at finding them. And these same data have established function for a lot of those sequences people formerly labeled junk and mistakes. And there are more arguments for evolution, but I think these 4 top arguments illustrate the main point. Evolution is utterly unconvincing Those evidences evolutionists cite are unconvincing because there are equally valid, if not better, alternative explanations that they just completely ignore. Those explanations of design, change within kinds, function, none of those show up in the textbooks. There's another problem with evolution, and it's this. So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. He said this on Canadian television. He said, "We can't see evolution happening. We don't live long enough." So that seems to contradict that first evidence for evolution we just discussed. They're not actually contradictions because he's using a different definition for evolution than the textbook is. So he's talking about this sort of big change. Molecules to man, parasites to people. This sort of big change, he says, we don't see amoebas becoming mammals today. We don't live long enough. Well, that's startling, because that's saying that the core of evolution, these processes, these big changes, no one can observe. The scientific method begins with observation. And so, by Richard Dawkins' own admission, this concept is outside the bounds of science. We can't observe it. Now, to be fair, that quote goes on. So he says, we can't see evolution happening, we don't live long enough, but of course Richard Dawkins believes it's true. Why? We look at the clues that remain, and they all overwhelmingly point to the same conclusion: evolution's a fact. What are the clues that remain? The ones we just went through. So how does it point to evolution being a fact? Because he ignores the alternative explanations. But along the way, he admits we don't see it. It's not scientific. And as we discussed last night, Darwin gave us a test to see if evolution were true. And to paraphrase his Victorian English, he said, if you can find something out there in nature that you can't build step by tiny step, then evolution's a failure. We looked at design in the cell. We saw that virtually every cell out there functions on this basic system: DNA being transcribed to RNA translated to protein, all three of these chemical components being interdependent upon one another. And so you have a real chicken and egg problem. Which came first? The DNA, the protein? They're dependent upon one another. That's probably a little bit hard to remember. A simpler example is simply reproduction, male and female. Evolution begins with some sort of self-reproducing cell, asexual reproduction. But at some point, this sort of reproduction has to happen. And so when the female evolves, what's she going to do for a couple million years without a male? Evolution stops. And female is an oversimplification. The amount of biochemistry and physiology involved in both the male and the female is incredible. But I'm keeping it simple for the evolutionist. If you just have to involve one component, and we call that female, and one that's male, you've got a problem. They have to both evolve at the same time, or evolution stops. So by Darwin's own admission, when we look at examples in nature, this is fatally flawed. We don't see evolution happening, and there are multiple examples in nature, I've just given you two, of things that you can't build by evolution. This is not the stuff that shows up in textbooks. So that raises the question, why do scientists, 87% of them, still cling to evolution when it's impossible, essentially, and the clues they appeal to are really weak? What do we do with that number? How could they all be so wrong? What are they missing? And I think it'll help if we step back and look at the nature of science very briefly, and this will help answer the question. So I mentioned that science begins with observation. That scientific method, maybe you learned it in high school: observation, testing, repetition. This is the powerful method that gives us antibiotics, that makes medical discoveries, that makes engineering discoveries. You make a hypothesis, you test it, you do it over and over and over again. Does penicillin kill bacteria? Well, you get some bacteria, you put penicillin on top of it. If they die, okay. Well, that may have been a fluke, so you do it again. And it's that aspect of repetition that separates the quacks from the real scientists. However well-intentioned or poorly intentioned quacks may be, their claims, by and large, are, well, here's one example from 1953 where this person was cured. And there's no need to repeat it because we know it works. Well, that's not how science works. You've got to repeat it. It may have worked for that person, but it's maybe because of their unique genetic constituents. Maybe there was something else going on. You've got to repeat. Well, that rigorous process, by definition, then excludes history from scientific investigation. Why? You can't go back in time and repeat past events. They're gone and done unless we invent a time machine. Does that mean history is unknowable? No. History is a forensics question. So by forensics, I mean court of law. And there's different ways to investigate it. So you think of the courtroom, what do you see as evidence? The key form of evidence you need to solve a courtroom case is reliable eyewitness testimony. People who were there at the scene of the crime, they saw what happened, they weren't bribed, they haven't been influenced, they don't have memory loss, they tell the truth. That's how you know what happens. Now in the courtroom you also see things like fingerprints, DNA evidence now these days, but that's all indirect evidence. It's ambiguous. Why? Because you can, with high levels of certainty, trace this blood stain and the DNA of that bloodstream to a single individual. But that doesn't tell you who did it, because they may have been framed. Someone may have gotten some blood put at the scene of a crime. It's eyewitness testimony that separates between these hypotheses. And to illustrate this, let's use something more familiar. JFK, who shot him? That's a question of history. It's a past tense verb. So I live in Dallas, and there's a whole museum dedicated to that question, the 6th floor museum, downtown Dealey Plaza. But the fact that this is a past tense question should immediately put a light bulb on our brain and say, science isn't going to answer it. You go to the 6th floor museum, you'll see all sorts of science. They've modeled and redone the bullet shots from the 6th floor window. They've measured the sound waves on the policeman's microphone. There's all sorts of scientific evidence. And once you get to the end of the museum, or if you just read 10 books on this topic, you'll get 10 different answers. If I ask you, those of you who were alive at the time, who did it? I'd probably get as many answers as there are people in the room. Why is there such disagreement? Is it because we don't have enough scientific evidence? No, it's because we don't have the key form of evidence. Some of the eyewitnesses who were there mysteriously disappeared. Some of those who were there, their testimonies don't agree. Some of those testimonies changed over time. You can't answer past questions of the past with science. You need eyewitness testimony. So were there any eyewitnesses to evolution? The question of origins is a forensics question, and so what we need to know is, where is the eyewitness testimony? Well, the evolutionists say that humans don't appear onto the scene until way late, 6 million years ago. And if there are 14 billion years in the history of the universe, 99% of the universe's history passes and no one was there to see it. So by definition, evolution doesn't have any eyewitness testimony, and they cling to that scientific evidence because it's all they have. Now that's very foreign to our thinking, because in modern America, if you have science, well, you've got the key stuff. That's how people think. But when we're talking history, that's not going to help you. Okay, so that makes sense. But there's something else that arises out of this consideration of science. Where is the eyewitness testimony? Scripture is eyewitness testimony. God was there, He did it, and He wrote it down for us through human instruments in Scripture. So the Bible should be brought into the science classroom when we're talking about origins, because it is a form of evidence. It is eyewitness testimony. And if you know the history of this country, that eyewitness testimony has been banned from the science classroom for 40 plus years. And this isn't just some creationist anger. You go to the evolutionary websites, they'll cite this case. So here's the National Center for Science Education, defending the teaching of evolution. That's their purpose. Since 1968, U.S. courts have consistently held that creationism is a particular religious viewpoint, and that teaching it in public schools would violate the First Amendment of the Constitution. So why do so many people hold to evolution? Well, we've got a whole generation of folks who've gone up through the educational system who've been taught to leave the Bible at the door. They don't have any eyewitness testimony. They cling to that indirect evidence they have, and they're taught to never consider the alternative. And it's the same whether they're atheists or whether they're born again. If they're raised in this system, they're taught to leave the Bible at the door. They can bring it to church, but don't bring it in the science classroom. So why do so many smart people hold to evolution? I think the answer is because they've all been taught to leave the counter hypothesis outside of the discussion. It's not that people are dumb, that 87% of scientists don't know what they're talking about. They're well trained. And they're trained to never consider the scripture. And so, what else is there besides evolution? That's why they never come to the creation perspective. They're taught to ignore it from the start. Some resources that help in this discussion. So, I mentioned Darwin's test for evolution. This book, Darwin's Black Box, is perhaps the best treatment of that, written by Mike Behe. Now, he's sort of an evolutionist. He's Catholic by profession. He has no problem with humans and chimpanzees sharing a common ancestor. He just doesn't think natural selection or evolution is the explanation, at least as Darwin proposed it. He's sort of an intelligent design guy. But his critique of Darwin is devastating. He goes through different examples from the cell, more than what I've covered this morning and last night, and he's a great writer. I mentioned this book last night and earlier today. This is sort of our signature one-stop book, Creation A to Z, Astronomy to Molecular Biology. The lecture I gave last night is one of these book chapters. I have a whole chapter on species and kinds and what's the answer there. Another chapter on biological similarity. So this is a great resource, especially for students in high school or going off to college. Highly recommend this as having it on, each of those students should have on their shelf as far as I'm concerned. This lecture, given by Randy Galuza, Making of a Baby, covers the physiology. There's nothing embarrassing in his lecture, but it's another example of here's what evolution can't do, sort of taking Darwin's test and applying it to human reproduction. Male and female is an oversimplification, gross oversimplification, and he's a medical doctor and just has a wonderful lecture on how much complexity is involved in the development of human life. This book, Creation Basics, as I mentioned last night, if you were here, is sort of the full-color, simplified version of that Creation Basics and Beyond. It's the start of a series of books we're trying to produce. The second one we've come out with is Guide to Animals. So again, sort of like that DK book series, the Barnes Noble version, but safe. Next one, I think, in production is on dinosaurs, and so just be aware that more of these will be coming out. We were not able to ship if I remember right, the Answers book for kids. You can get it from Answers in Genesis, our sister organization. Creation A to Z for the younger ones. We do have a free magazine, Acts and Facts. You can sign up for it, again, in that back room. This is probably the best way to keep up to speed on what the contemporary debate is. What are the latest answers we've been discovering? We have an active research program. And again, this afternoon, I'll be telling you about one of the newest things we've found. Hear stuff in the news, we'll usually address it here. And again, if you have a question that doesn't get answered this weekend, or maybe you think of something Sunday afternoon, Monday morning, I do have a public Facebook page that I've created simply for the purpose of interacting more easily. You email our website, those questions usually get distributed. So just to make communication easier, this is up there for your benefit, and then it gives me fodder for writing articles as well. You ask a question, I usually turn it into an article response. And 40 years worth of what we've written is on our website, icr.org, free of charge, so please avail yourself of that. Of course, our sister organizations, Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International, so answersingenesis.org, creation.com. There's an enormous wealth of information out there at your fingertips, free of charge, for anyone who wants to look. So we're going to take a break now, and when we return, we'll be talking about Adam and Eve and what does the genetics actually say. So return at 10:30.